Okay, sorry about that. I had the recording off at the beginning because okay. So we're talking about I didn't say anything very interesting. It was all rubbish. I was talking about language and about how listening to someone talk in English or in Turkish is like seeing a person in baggy clothes and you're interested what's underneath the clothes, but you don't really get very much of an idea. Yeah. And the task of philosophy is to, in some sense, take off the clothes and get to see the naked body. Problem is that most of the time that all you've got in philosophy is the clothes. It's like a Scooby-Doo film. Like you take off the clothes and there's just air there. It's like, oh, there is no body. Yeah, it's that's going to be, yeah, like so using everyday language to say something that there is some body underneath and you can discover what's being said. That's what science is. Yeah, so scientific language, maybe people are a bit floppy and you have to kind of undress it. Yeah, but most of philosophy is like you think there's someone there underneath the clothes and you take the clothes off and there's just air. That's basically the idea. So most of the propositions and questions to be found in philosophical works are not force, but nonsense. And so consequently, we cannot give any answer to the questions of this kind, but can only point out that they are nonsensical. It's interesting because he offers an account of what it is for a claim to be nonsense. Yeah, but now he's suggesting that questions can be sort of nonsense as well. Yeah, and so we might wonder what it is that makes a question nonsense. I take it that a sort of question that can't be answered is a sort of nonsense question. So I think Wittgenstein thinks that a question only makes sense if you'd have some idea that what would count as an answer to it. So there's got to be some sort of answer. So a question that can't be answered, I think is going to be something nonsense. Yeah, and so he says that most of the propositions and questions of philosophers arise from our failure to understand the logic of our language. Yeah, and so in some sense, that questions, he says they belong to the same class as the question whether the good is more or less identical than the beautiful. Yeah, it's just like, hold on a minute, what does that mean? Yeah, is Lucas more identical than Zubaydah? Identical to what? Identical is a relation between two things. Well, identity is weird, but let's think it's a relation between two things. Yeah, then to say that one thing is more identical doesn't make any sense. Yeah, so that most of the claims and questions of philosophy are nonsense in that in some sense they're sort of ungrammatical. Yeah, they don't make any sense. And so he says it is not surprising that the deepest problems are in fact not problems at all. So here we have the sort of idea that we've got this theory of meaning he's offered. This theory of meaning is going to give an account of what makes a claim meaningful, what gives it sense. He's then also going to talk a bit about logic and mathematics, which these claims, in a sense, lack sense without being nonsense. But we get this idea that most of the problems of philosophy are sort of pseudo problems. And so what we can do is, rather than solving the problems of philosophy, we can engage in something like philosophical therapy, and we can come to see that these seeming problems aren't really problems at all. Yeah, so think about the King of France. The King of France is bald, but the King of France doesn't exist. But the King of France seems like a name. So are there objects that don't exist? Yeah, so we get into these worries about non-existent objects because we've got what seem like empty names. And empty names, at least purportedly, refer But then the sort of answer to this is, no, you're just being seduced by grammar, that the reason you think that there are empty names is because we've got definite descriptions that grammatically look like they're functioning as names. But once we give a kind of good Russellian analysis of these claims, we come to see that there's no problem at all. So he says, all philosophy is a critique of language. So this is like Rorty famously talks about the kind of linguistic turn in philosophy. Richard Rorty. People know Rorty? He's still someone. Richard Rorty. He was one of the sort of American analytic philosophers who sort of switched over a bit to the more continental tradition, sort of influenced by the American pragmatist tradition. He was at Harvard. He does this sort of American style pragmatism. And he had this idea. He had one book called Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, which is a sort of argument against a sort of correspondence theory of truth and the idea that we can so it's a sort of an attack on the sort of tractatist sort of way of thinking about thinking, that somehow we picture the world. And so we have two things. We have the world, and then we have the mirror of the world in our heads. So we have these two things. And then truth has got to do with the degree to which our picture is accurate. And instead of this, he goes for this more pragmatist view, the sort of view we find in the later Wittgenstein. But I mean, what we're seeing in these passages is something like that laid at the heart of the linguistic turn in philosophy, where all philosophy is a critique of language. This is something that is very new. Like in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, philosophy was about knowledge. It was about cognition. It was about understanding experience. But Wittgenstein kind of comes out and says, no, we've got another conception of what philosophy is. That the task of philosophy is a critique of language. And it's a critique of language where we can use the tools of modern logic to, in some sense, get at the sort of deep structure of things. And once we do this, certain philosophical worries on this therapeutic account are going to disappear. So he says it was Russell who performed the service of showing that the apparent logical form of a proposition need not be its real one. So we've got the King of France is bald. It looks like on the surface that the logical form of this proposition is a subject-predicate proposition. We've got a name and we've got a property. But actually, it turns out on the Russellian analysis, you've got a much more complex proposition that doesn't contain any names of individuals. You've just got properties and quantifiers, and variables. You haven't got an individual proposition. You've got a general proposition. This is the language that Wittgenstein's going to be using later. So he talks about this. This is, I think, very significant, and this is something that continues. Now, a proposition is a picture of reality. This is an important claim, but I want to move forward to look at the passages where he talks about philosophy. So if we come down to page 29, so we've got another discussion starting at 4.1, which also is going to involve kind of Wittgenstein, Russellian-Stein, I don't know, offering a conception of what philosophy is. So he says, so propositions represent the existence and non-existence of states of affairs. I take it this is going to be elementary propositions. Elementary propositions are propositions that only contain names. So I think this claim now is about elementary propositions that don't involve any logical apparatus. Yeah. So propositions represent the existence and non-existence of states of affairs. And the totality of true propositions is the whole of natural science, or the whole corpus of the natural sciences. So that natural science is just a collection of sort of true propositions. The goal of natural science is to kind of have an understanding of the way the world is. Philosophy, he says, though, then, is not one of the natural sciences. Yeah. So if we think that propositions, in some sense, describe the world, yeah, and this is the task of science, the task of philosophy isn't to describe the world. So philosophy is not one of the natural sciences. He said the word philosophy must mean something whose place is above or below the natural sciences, not beside them. Now, I think many of the kind of followers of Wittgenstein were sort of anti-philosophy in some sense, that philosophy is sort of below the natural sciences. It's I think Wittgenstein himself, as I've suggested, was more of a mystic. So what is the task of philosophy if it's not part of the natural sciences? Well, philosophy aims at the logical clarification of thoughts. Yeah. And this means that philosophy then is not a body of doctrine, but it's an activity. Yeah. So you might think that everything. So Wittgenstein claims that everything he says in the Tractatus is nonsense. Yeah. But it's a nonsense that once you've understood it, you'll kind of throw away the ladder. But if you think that kind of philosophy isn't a collection of claims, philosophy is not a body of doctrines, but an activity. What philosophy is, I think, on this picture is a sort of, you might think, is an ability. Yeah. And rather than kind of teaching us the truth of something, maybe Wittgenstein thinks that the goal of the Tractatus is to teach us how to do something. And by reading these sentences that, strictly speaking, are nonsense, we can learn to do something. What we can learn to do is we can learn to clarify our thoughts. Yeah. And we do this, he does this by using sentences that, strictly speaking, aren't true, but they're things you can use untrue sentences to teach, not to give someone any knowledge but to help them acquire a certain type of know-how. Yeah, so maybe the way of thinking about the Tractatus is what Wittgenstein's primarily interested in achieving. So one view of the Tractatus is it's all rubbish and it's all nonsense and we just throw it away, and then what's the point? But we might think that one can learn a practical skill through kind of through sentences that are nonsense. You can use language to teach someone how to do something. Yeah. And you can successfully do this even if the claims you're making don't make sense. They can still play a role in this sort of teaching someone a sort of ability. I think this is kind of how I sort of think about the Wittgenstein's way of thinking about the task of philosophy. So he says, a philosophical work consists essentially of elucidations. It does not result in philosophical propositions. So the goal of the sort of task of philosophy is not to make philosophical claims, but it's a certain type of activity. Yeah, so he says, without philosophy, thoughts are, as it were, cloudy and indistinct. Its task is to make them clear and to give them sharp boundaries. So philosophical training and activity helps us to clarify our thoughts. Yeah, but it turns out that the only thoughts that can really be clarified are sort of descriptive thoughts. Now, so I think one thing about this is Wittgenstein, I don't know, was very Scandinavian in his sort of tastes. Quine said he liked desert landscapes. I think Wittgenstein wouldn't have liked them because desert landscapes are a bit too, I don't know, what's the word? Decorative. I don't know, they're not stark enough. He liked kind of being in a room with just like one chair, yeah, and a table, and that's it. We want to have, it's a very empty sort of aesthetic. Think about IKEA, think about modernist architecture. Wittgenstein was engaged in architecture. He's very precise. They built this building and he was like, oh, no, you have to knock down the ceiling. It needs to be reduced by 6 centimeters. It's just like, we can't have anything decorative in there, but like, it's just a few inches too high, the ceiling. It doesn't work. It's wrong. I can't deal with it. So oops. So how did I get here again? Yeah, so we have this idea of philosophy as sort of conceptual clarification. That philosophy then has this task of setting limits. Yeah, so he says philosophy sets limits to the much disputed sphere of natural science. So one way of kind of thinking about setting limits to this sphere is to, this boundary dispute. Is this claim scientific or not? Is it descriptive? And then one way of setting the limits is to think, well, the task of philosophy is to just rule out any people making claims that aren't natural science. This is how the sort of logical positivists read him, that on the one hand side, you've got natural science, on the other side, you've got metaphysics. Metaphysics is bullshit. And the task of philosophy is to sort of call out bullshit and to eliminate metaphysics. Yeah. So this is like Carnap's elimination of metaphysics through the logical analysis of language. But I think in another sense, that because of this mystical side, you might think that the other thing philosophy does is to set limits to the natural sciences. Yeah. Because there's a whole sphere of things that goes beyond what can be said. And I think this is kind of the other way of looking at it, the more kind of mystical side. Yeah, so he says it must set limits to what can be thought, but then in so doing, to what cannot be thought. Yeah, and so it must set limits to what cannot be thought by working outwards through what can be thought. So there are things that can't be thought. And this is the kind of the notion of things that can't be thought. Once again, that here we've got, I mean, is this nonsense? Yeah, so Wittgenstein's talking about the things we can't talk about. But in talking about the things we can't talk about, you're referring to the things that we can't talk about, and therefore you're talking about them. And it's like, hold on a minute, that's just a mess. Like, I thought these were things we can't talk about. Yeah, so the idea of the concept, the thought of things that cannot be thought is there seems to be something paradoxical about the concept of that which cannot be thought. Yeah, that which goes beyond the limits of thought. If anyone's interested in sort of logic and a kind of mishmash of sort of logic, Heidegger, Hegel, and Japanese philosophy, which is quite cool. Do people know Graham Priest? Does anyone heard of Graham Priest? So Graham Priest is a really cool guy. He's like one of the leading logicians, PhD in maths, was at St Andrews, but he's the leader of this sort of dialethism. So you have paraconsistent logic. So paraconsistent logics are logics in which you can have contradictions and they don't fuck everything up. So in classical logic, everything follows from a contradiction. So if you have one contradiction, P and not P entails Q. So everything follows from a contradiction. And so, of course, paraconsistent logics you need for things like databases or beliefs. So I'm pretty sure that I've got some contradictory beliefs. Somehow there's some inconsistency in my beliefs. Therefore, it's rational for me to believe anything because anything follows from a contradiction. You've got some database and you want to do a logic of databases. You don't want classical logic for that because there's going to be some contradictory information. Yeah, you don't want to kind of plug all the information in and then the logic just tells you, well, you can believe anything you want because I found one contradiction. You want a logic that kind of, in some sense, when it finds contradictions, it kind of quarantines the contradictions and lets you get on with kind of rational arguments without having to deal with them. So paraconsistent logics are, everyone's, for some things, are happy with paraconsistent logics. So lots of Australians have worked on paraconsistent logics. Richard Routley is probably the most famous person. He works on relevance logics. So relevance logics are logics where, you can't, there has to be some relationship between the premise and the conclusion. So you can't get from P and not P to Q. Yeah, that doesn't follow. P and not P doesn't entail Q because entailment involves some sort of relation between the premise and the premises and the conclusion. Dialethism is a logic that thinks that there are some true contradictions. Yeah, and certain types of Buddhist logic, Jaina logics, a bunch of Indian logics, classical Indian logics allow for true contradictions. And so he's one of the leading proponents and people who've worked through and formalized this sort of dialectic logics. And he's got a nice book called Beyond the Limits of Thought, which is a book about thinking the unthinkable from a kind of biologician, but he talks about Hegel and Heidegger, and it's sort of fun. And there's lots of interesting questions. If people find these sort of questions interesting, his book, Beyond the Limits of Thought, is quite nice. He starts off with Kant. So Kant, of course, you've got the idea of the thing in itself, which can't be known. In some sense, it's beyond our capacity to cognize. But in some sense, in order to think of phenomena as phenomena, we've got to be able to think about things that we can't know anything about. Yeah. So, and in some sense, we set the limit to the sphere of the phenomenal by thinking about these things that are beyond the possible limits of experience. So you might think when you're thinking about this going beyond the limits of thought, you might think about the phenomenal and the intelligible or the noumenal in Kant. And so, yeah, so thinking about what can't be thought is sort of difficult. And so he says that we've got to set limits to what cannot be thought by working outward through what can be thought. So in the first sentence, he says something that can't be said because he's talking about that which can't be thought. But in some sense, we can't make any sense of that. And then the sort of idea, though, that we can kind of come to see the limits of thought just by starting off with what we can think and slowly expanding it until we stop. Yeah, so maybe the way to set limits to thought is just to start from what can be thought and then just sort of expand. But there's something paradoxical about this idea of that which can't be thought about. And I think Wittgenstein is very concerned with this paradoxicality. If you remember in the second paragraph of the preface, he kind of talks about this idea of the sort of limits of thought and the sort of so he says that in some sense it will signify what cannot be said by presenting clearly what can be said. So in some sense you don't, it's gonna kind of intimate or point to, or is it going to whistle the unthinkable? I don't know. This is but it will signify what cannot be said, not describe. You can't describe that which can't be described, but you can somehow point to what can't be described by presenting clearly what can be described. So everything that can be thought at all can be thought clearly. And everything that can be put into words can be put clearly. And so try and put everything clearly, and then how do you say this without saying something that can't be said clearly? Then, and there's nothing more. This is the idea. But he's deeply interested in the idea of that which cannot be thought about, or that which cannot be said. But how do you think about that which can't be thought about? Okay, so there's a bunch of interesting stuff about philosophy. Let's run forward and start talking about his views on logic. Okay, so we haven't got that much time now, so I'll just start here. I'll just say that, well, it turns out we're going to have to make a distinction between two types of proposition. We're going to have elementary propositions and then complex propositions. And complex propositions are combinations of elementary propositions and involve elementary symbolism. Turns out that we're going to have propositions with quantifiers that in some sense aren't going to be elementary propositions. So once quantifiers are going to be a bit complicated. But an elementary proposition asserts the existence of a state of affairs. So and a state, remember from the discussion of a world, a state of affair, a proposition represents a possible way the world could be. So a state of affairs is a possible way the world could be. And we've got all the possible ways the world could be and the actual ways the world could be. So a state of affairs includes the actual way the world is, plus all of the possible ways things could be. So a proposition, an elementary proposition, asserts a possible way the world could be. It's going to turn out that he thinks that this means that all elementary propositions are going to be expressions of contingent truths. So they're all going to, because if the world could be one way, then you've got objects linked together that could be linked together in different ways. So an elementary proposition asserts the existence of a state of affairs, and an elementary proposition consists of names. It's a nexus, a concatenation of names. So the simplest type of elementary proposition is going to be a subject-predicate proposition. And there you've got two names, the names of an individual and the names of a property, F-A. You put these two names together in a way that is syntactically allowed. So it's the combination of names is something that's done through sort of syntax. We have these rules for saying which things are combinable or not. And an elementary proposition is just a sort of string of names that are put together in a way that is syntactically, grammatically allowed. and so we have something like FA. He's now going to kind of give an account of how we can then explain how we can introduce the idea of logical symbolism. So what he does over the next few pages is basically to invent truth tables. I guess you've all done truth tables. Yeah, you know how truth tables work. And I take it the sort of idea here is that we use truth tables to sort of define the meaning of logical symbols. Yeah. So what we do in a truth table is the truth table is used to give us a definition of the logical constants, the logical operators. Yeah. And so we have these names of propositions that in order to do this, it means that we've got to have some conception of understanding of truth that is independent of our understanding of logic. And this is what Wittgenstein gives us. You know, this whole stuff about the world, states of affairs, picture theory of meaning. Part of what he's doing is offering us a theory of truth. An elementary proposition is true if it represents the actual states of affairs. Another name for an actual state of affairs is a fact. So a proposition is true if it sort of depicts a fact. It's false if it depicts a possible way the world could be, but the world isn't that way. Yeah, so we've got this account of truth, and so we've got elementary propositions. We've got an account of the distinction between truth and falsity, and now, given this, we can now define the logical constants by using truth tables. And that's what the task of the next few pages is, or the next few sections, is to basically give us a definition of all of the logical connectives. Yeah. And then given this definition, he's then going to give us an account of logical truth. Yeah. And it turns out that logical truth is very different from it's necessary truth. Yeah. And logical truth, according to this view, don't say anything. And I think this way of thinking about the meaning of the logical operators is, I think, one of the two standard views about meaning of logical operators. The alternative view is to think that we can define the operators in terms of something like introduction and elimination rules. Yeah, so this is that in some sense we don't need semantics. We don't need any notion of truth in order to understand and. Yeah, so and, yeah, if you've got P and then you write down Q, you're allowed to write down P and Q. And if you're allowed to write down P and Q, you're allowed to write down Q. If you've already written down P and Q, the elimination rule is that you can then write down P, you can write down Q. And this is the way of explaining the meaning of logical operators that doesn't presuppose a notion of truth. Yeah. So these are and I take it the first view is the sort of Tractatian view. It's a view that it's sort of quite realist in some sense of realist. It thinks that language, you have it presupposes something like a correspondence theory of truth. It seems like if you're a limitativist about truth, if you're someone who downplays truth as a metaphysical notion, then you're not going to be able to probably it's going to be difficult to use the notion of truth to explain the meaning of logical constants. It seems to me that you need to be committed to a sort of fairly substantial view about truth in order to do what Wittgenstein's going to do now. Yeah. Okay, so next class, let's see how the election goes. maybe the next class we can do face-to-face. Let's see. It might just be a mess. Who knows what's going to happen next week? So let's hope Everything's going to be okay? Okay. Ciao. Bye.